If you have the practice test done, I'll take it. If you want another practice test, I have another one for it. Just if you want to just practice on your own.
May 2nd.
Today?
Yes.
May 3rd.
Tomorrow is the best day ever.
Why's that?
May the 4th.
Oh, God. I don't know if that qualifies for the best day. Let's go. Huh?
Arbor Day is probably the best day.
Arbor Day's a good day. I like Arbor Day a lot. Okay, here's the good news. So, if you have a review packet, I'm going to go through a bunch of the things that will be directly put on the review packet. I do. Good. Good. Anybody else have that test? Anybody else have that test? We're going to get back and recycle them again. Does anybody else want another practice test? If you do, I can give you another practice test, just for you to look at, just for more questions. It really does help me go through them, just see the way they write them. And they'll do the similar thing for the short answer questions. They will take, for the short answer questions, they'll give you some kind of stimuli, little document for you to think about what you're going to short ID. And I did do a review session last night. A lot of people were there. I did record it. And a lot of people approached me and said they would like one more. And so it appears like we'll do one Tuesday night too. I'll do the last one. And I'll go through as much as I possibly can. There'll be some things I'm not going to quite get to in the 60s, and I'm just sorry. That's just the way it is. So I'll try my best to fill it in. And if you want to come in at lunch and just ask a couple quick questions, you're more than welcome to sit and eat lunch. I'll be glad to do that if you want. But your test is Thursday. What time do you have to be there? 4:45 a.m. Make sure you're there at 4:45. 7:45. Yes. How many pencils are you going to bring?
8.
90. You don't have 90, you will not be allowed in. I don't make the rules, I just follow. Bring a few pins, black or blue, please.
Mr. Parker, you know if we use mechanical pencil?
Huh?
We use mechanical pencil.
You know, I don't know. I really don't know. The count is in an email. Check that email, please, and I'll check it again.
Yeah, it said in the email.
Let me find out. I mean, they have, it's so stupid that they won't let you use mechanical pencils. I can't even wrap my mind around the stupidity. Because they're all number 2. Well, they did ban number 2 for like ACT and stuff, or mechanical pencils. But they let you have pens and what's, God, okay. So, huh?
It's for taekwondo.
Actually, yeah, that's, I think it's just to make rules to make rules, but they claim well you could bring pencils in and somehow cheat. Like hiding. Yeah.
I mean, I guess you can.
Well, you can do it with a pen too.
Yeah.
So, and one more thing, don't bring your phone, don't bring any of that kind of stuff. Yeah, but iWatch, don't wear it. I mean, you put the counselor in a really bad position, because technically they're supposed to throw your test away if you have one. Do not put them in that position. It's easy to forget that you have it. Just don't bring it, okay?
The moment you talk about it, I remember the calendar thing, the ones that you can block out.
Oh, yeah.
That was a good kind.
I can't believe you just told everybody that. All right, so if you have your review packet, go and take that up, and I'm going to go through a bunch of stuff that'll be directly on there. And so tomorrow night at 7, I will do a review if enough people want to do it, but it seemed like a lot of people have folks that say they did. I covered a lot yesterday. It's amazing how much stuff I can cover. And I was going to this one, so I want to tell more, but I can't. Are we good? All right, let's get right to the world getting complex. Are you ready? It's actually more difficult to solve problems when they call your bluff. And remember brinksmanship? They say, we're going to blow the world up unless you do what we want. And what happens if they call your bluff? This is going to happen a number of times. This has happened in your lifetime in places like Syria. So looking at page 10, we'll get to the very first one. So the CIA will be used to do undercover operations, technically to fight for democracy. That's what we're going to be claiming. But in reality, virtually every time the United States is going to be putting into power either a more repressive dictatorship or getting rid of a democracy completely. Most famously, one of the most important events in American history, yes, that pigeon does have a camera on it. That is from the Stasi Museum, the East German secret police in Berlin. Iran. Iran in 1953. So this is one of the biggest events in foreign policy history. Most Americans did not know what happened in Iran until the 1970s. 1976 to be exact. Even though Iran all knew. Everybody outside the US knew, yes.
So we're doing this on the review sheet, right?
We can do it on the review sheet too, yeah.
So it doesn't need to go on.
If you want to just do a straight to your review sheet, just do it there.
Okay.
Sound good? So, Iran had a democracy, and the leader of democracy was this guy right here, Mohammad Mossadegh. And he was a nationalist, and Iran is dirt poor. But what does Iran have? Oil. And so he nationalized oil in 1952. Approximately 90% of all the oil revenues went to Britain, based on an unequal treaty. They wanted the oil revenues to stay there. And Britain was furious. How dare you take the oil that we stole fair and square? And this was a homegrown democracy in Iran. Had a constitution, had a constitutional monarch, had a legislature, homegrown. Britain tried to get Truman to do something, help him overthrow Mossadegh. Britain refused, or I'm sorry, Truman refused. Truman wanted allies in the Middle East, and Mossadegh was a hero to many countries trying to break away from foreign domination. But Eisenhower's in power, and Allen Dulles, the Secretary of State, oh, and his brother was also the head of the CIA, they said, let's get him. And how did they do it? Mossadegh, they claim, was a what? Communist. So the CIA overthrew him. He's a communist. I didn't write that down, but he's a communist. And they paid off army and fundamentalist Shia clerics saying Mossadegh's going to get rid of Islam. They're godless communists. And this will have no problem down the road. Nothing to see here. Don't worry about this. And they overthrew him. Mossadegh was completely taken by surprise. He thought that he didn't trust Britain for good reason, but thought the United States would defend this democracy. Was so shocked. But I have to remind you, Americans did not know this happened. There was rumors, but it would not come out until 1976. And this is going to have a huge deal down the road. There's Mossadegh being arrested because the old monarch, Shah Reza Pahlavi, became the dictator. And they divvied up the oil. 40% went to Britain, 40% went to the US, and 20% went to him. Not Iran, him. He would set up a horrible, brutal dictatorship. Their secret police was infamous for their tortures, which now the current Iranian government does the same tortures. So this nasty dictatorship, in fact, they were trained by the CIA. The US would have bases there. It was repressive on any kind of political movements, even though it did allow for some more freedom for groups that were repressed, to a lesser degree Kurds, but also for women. So this has got horrible repercussions down the road. And this is what we get to a term called blowback. And this is a term I have to tell you about. Because blowback is the unintended consequences of covert actions. So this was seen as a great success. The CIA is brilliant. We got rid of the communists. This is going to be a disaster that we are paying for to this day. It's going to be spread all throughout the world because the US didn't know this, but everybody in the Middle East knew the United States overthrew it. They might not know the details, and the US involvement is going to be exaggerated. But heck, it's always easier to blame somebody else. So they really exaggerated the direct US involvement that existed. The US is going to promote this awful dictatorship, and the only ones that are going to rebel this blowback will be, oh, as luck would have it, if you turn the page to page 11, and I know I didn't leave you much space because you are young and or spry, but look a third of the way down on the right, it has Iranian Revolution. Oh, in all these things happen at once. I didn't mean it'd be the rise of fundamentalist Islam would come out of this, all over the Middle East. Nothing to see here. Move on. This is unbelievable. By the way, yes, people said, boy, this is stupid, but it worked. But Iranian Revolution, 1978. Fundamentalist Shia Muslims, with help of Democrats, which were quickly brushed aside, small d Democrats, who wanted democracy in Iran, overthrew the Shah. They spent billions of dollars for weapons, and the army just fell apart in '79. And who did the new government in Iran blame for all their problems? The U.S. Was the U.S. to blame? Partially. But if you're trying to get people mad, are you going to blame yourself? No. You blame the other people. And then, okay, the Shah was ill. He fled in exile. The Carter administration allowed him in because he had cancer. And people told him, don't do that. Well, people in Iran heard the Shah went to the U.S. and it was like, it's 53 all over. You ever catch my drift? It's 53. So what happened? Iranian students that were radicalized by the revolution in 1979 stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took everyone hostage. And through a number of blunders and just total misrule by the Iranian government, but also just what could the U.S. do, 50 hostages will be held for 444 days. This is going to be so humiliating for the United States. And this will definitely help bring about the conservative revival of the late 1970s. If you look at the bottom, I have conservative backlash, partially over Iran, because we look so weak. Yes. 444. Now, it's, there's not a lot the U.S. could have done to free the hostages, and this was just, such a disaster. But without a doubt, this probably helped bring about the election of Ronald Reagan and the conservative revival, without a doubt. But are we done? No, not even close. If you notice right next to it, on that chart, there's Afghanistan. You see Afghanistan right next to it? Well, in 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Okay, Afghanistan was a pro-Soviet government. That government was removed from office, and the Soviets were convinced, here comes the fundamentalist revolution into the Soviet Union. All this area of the Soviet Union, now independent countries, have huge Muslim majorities. And they were fearful that might get a revolution there. So the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Now, this was an act of pure desperation by the Soviets, but the United States saw this first off as Soviet expansion. In fact, the United States would boycott the Moscow Olympics because of this, 1980. And then guess who would boycott the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984? The Soviets, which shows you how the Olympics, this great spectacle of amateur athletic, let's be serious. But beginning in the 1980s in Afghanistan, the United States began to arm the guerrillas fighting the Soviets. It's really hard to fight in Afghanistan. Mountains, very divided. The country's divided up in little tribal areas. Invading armies have lost every single time they've invaded. It's called yeah, I went to the cemetery of empires. But thank you for saying graveyard. The cemetery of empires, that's not right. But the United States helped arm, and the Soviets would leave at the end of the decade, of the 1980s. Humiliating defeat for the Soviets. The Civil War continued in Afghanistan all the way through, about 20 to 11. Yeah, still going on, the Civil War. Continuous fighting. But why is it such a big deal? Well, the United States encouraged fundamentalist Muslims, especially Shia Muslims, all over the Arab world to come help fight the Soviets, the godless commies. And they came. funneled with the help of the CIA and Pakistani intelligence, long story. But they fought there and helped remove the Soviets. In fact, one of the groups there, they would set up, they call it a base, the base to bring in guerrillas. And the term for the base, you might have heard of this, is called Al-Qaeda. That just means the base. The US supported them. And who was the head of Al-Qaeda? The son of a very wealthy Saudi Arabian family by the name of Osama bin Laden. And so let's turn the page to page 12. On page 12, halfway down, yes, all directly related to Iran, is the September 11th, 2001 attacks. So I didn't even put that down there, but I should have. There's so many things, but it's directly related to Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda remained in Afghanistan. They all went to a few other things there. In the 1990s, all kinds of, or there was a number of terrorist attacks during that decade. But Al-Qaeda blaming the United States for abandoning Afghanistan to civil war, but also U.S. policy in the Middle East, explicitly supporting dictatorships, also supportive Israel. They attacked the United States on September 11th. Directly connected to Afghanistan, which is directly connected to Iran. And it was kind of a one-shot thing. Al-Qaeda had a whole series of bad moves by the United States, and depending on your point of view, but I would say unlucky breaks. It all worked out where they could do this horrific attack. Why the World Trade Center? That was seen as a center of American financial power, as they saw with destroying the Middle East. They tried to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993 and failed with a bomb attack in their basement garage. And using airplanes as bombs, which was not, this was well known as a potential attack. They thought they might do it with the Eiffel Tower in 1999. They knew about this. This would be the second bloodiest day in American history. And what would that lead to? Huh? The United States, actually we didn't really invade. There was a civil war in Afghanistan. We got involved, we picked a side, and then never left. But yeah, the U.S. attacked and helped attack Afghanistan because that's where Al-Qaeda was based. And as luck would have it, that's right next to it, isn't it? Right next to September 11th, 2001, Afghanistan, where the U.S. has been involved in this Afghani civil war for 20 years. And we're kind of stuck with a series of corrupt governments, but the United States was involved technically to get Al-Qaeda. But we ended up attacking the government that was welcoming Al-Qaeda as a guest because they helped them in the civil war, called the Taliban, who didn't attack the United States. And we're still there. And this directly leads to Iraq, but not the Iraq War above. If you look a little bit further up there, it has the Persian Gulf War. That is going to be the United States attacking, well, let's get backtrack just a little bit, Persian Gulf War. Iraq had a dictatorship that was terrified of Iran. A dictatorship supported by the CIA at first. Have you heard of a guy named Saddam Hussein? And in 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq attacked Iran. A horrible, bloody, nightmarish war. When I was your age, this was the Persian Gulf War, Iraq-Iran. The war ended in a bloody stalemate in '88. Iraq blamed neighboring Kuwait for low oil prices and for helping Iran. So in 1990, this is what we got to get down. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Directly because of what happened in Iran. The U.S. was no friend of Kuwait and kind of shocked Iraq when the U.S. would lead a coalition of almost 40 countries to push Iraq out of Kuwait. Now, Iraq's army, devastated by 8 years of a bloody war, had no real air force, and they would be defeated. The U.S. left Saddam Hussein in power. We didn't want to get involved in the mess of Iraqi politics. 10 years later, we get involved in the mess of Iraqi politics. So Saddam Hussein remained in power. Now, go down to 2003. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The U.S. claimed that Iraq was involved in the September 11th attack and were building weapons of mass destruction. Both were not true. Iraq and Al Qaeda are more enemies, so that was always kind of ridiculous. And no, they weren't building weapons of mass destruction. They tried in the 80s, but it was still not awful. But the U.S. invaded in 2003, and this turned into a bloody, horrible civil war. And now the government in power in Iraq, in place by the United States, is pro-Iran. All these things relate. This is why I've got to talk about Iran. Iran was such a big deal. Why do you think Iran wants nuclear weapons? To deter the United States. Now, don't get me wrong. The Iranian government is a horrible, brutal, quasi-theocratic, corrupt state. Yet they're able to stay in power because they say, see, look how bad the United States is. They're coming. Still the same thing in Korea. And we kind of stumble into that. Too. Big deal. So, 1954, the same thing happened in Guatemala. So the next thing on the chart. Guatemala, homegrown democracy. Here's the Amfiwaga, I'm mispronouncing that, Arbenz. The Arbenz government. He's a nationalist too. And remember United Fruit, the big fruit company? Guatemala is right next to Iraq, by the way. The big fruit company. So it should be on page 9. Is that right? Page 10, 9. Yeah, right there. Right in the middle, Guatemala. United Fruit controlled almost all the arable land. The poverty rate was incredibly high. So what did, it's called land reform. The Arbenz government wanted to buy the land, force United Fruit to sell the land and give it to peasants. Land reform. Because bananas are big business. So naturally Arbenz is a what? He's a communist. Is he a communist? Absolutely not. Or was he? He's not passed away. But immediately it's claimed he was a communist, especially by United Fruit. He's a communist. The Secretary of State was a big shareholder in United Fruit, by the way. But they're really scared this might spread to other Central American countries. So they don't want a democracy that might take away the land from United Fruit. So the CIA, fresh flesh from the great victory in Iran, set to overthrow Guatemala. The CIA set up a base in Honduras. They found an army officer who was compliant. His name was Carlos Armas, they kind of created an army out of Holcroft, and they invaded, and the plan was Arbenz government would just collapse. It didn't quite work that way. The Arbenz government was a little more resilient, but when they realized the U.S. meant to have them gone, the Arbenz government collapsed. And what came out of this? The CIA would sponsor another dictatorship that would last for 25 years. Here's Armas being driven into Guatemala City, and I love this because it's just, who's that guy? Oh, he was the head of the CIA operation. People in the United States did not know about this completely until the 70s, but everybody in Central America. And it told every government in Central America, you try land reform or any democratic reforms, you're out. And if you want to know why so many people in Guatemala or Honduras are so impoverished and desperate to seek immunity in the United States right now coming to the border, I've just basically explained to you. Now, let's be clear about it. It doesn't mean that the people in Guatemala and Honduras aren't responsible for their own problems. But the United States certainly did not help here. Yeah, maybe I'll tell you the whole story about this in another time. But the U.S. claimed it was fighting for democracy. In fact, they said Armas was the equivalent of American freedom fighters. George Washington. I should add, we're coming to Cuba, similar things going to happen to Cuba. It's called the Bay of Pigs. So, speaking of that, it's good stuff. I will tell you this. After the exam, I'll take a couple days and just tell you stories I've been skipping. Would you want to hear some stories? About me growing up in Miles City? Yes, I know, we all do. That's what it'll be, me growing up. I know. I better not tell you. If you guys would be just like, how did you do it? Speaking of Civil War, French Indochina. So if you look down a little bit lower on your review sheet, it should have Dien Bien Phu and Geneva. And Dien Bien Phu was the last battle of the French effort to keep their colony. The French wanted to keep their colony, French Indochina. And the Japanese took it. Remember, this is one of the causes for the war. Fighting him were the Viet Minh, their leader Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh were nationalists, but I want to be very clear about it. Ho Chi Minh, right here with American advisors, the Americans helped him fight the Japanese in World War II and then abandoned him. Why? We need French help in Europe. French want to keep their colony. He's a communist. So the U.S. began to aid because of the domino theory. The French by 1952 don't want anything. They're like, we're not winning. This isn't going to work. We're just going to let them have independence. But you know what kept the French there? U.S. money. U.S. money. Ho Chi Minh, as a young man, was at Versailles, trying to get independence for French Indochina, and he was just kind of brushed aside. So the U.S. actually, by 54, the French went out. The U.S. were providing over half the money for the French to stay there. Think about this for a second. The U.S. is spending money for France to keep their colony that France doesn't want anymore. They decide we're going to keep Algeria, which would be a terrible mistake for them. So, one last gasp effort by the French were to drop parachutists right here at a place called Dien Bien Phu. Cut off a supply line, but instead they got cut off. Viet Minh forces surrounded them, and now the French are trapped. The problem is, how do you get in? If they drive, they're ambushed in the mountains. The French have planes, but the airfield was overrun. Helicopters were brand new, and the French only had 2 of them. In fact, helicopters were the reason why the United States thought they would win in Vietnam. So, they besieged them. President Eisenhower even considered using nuclear weapons to support the French. That should give you an idea how insane it got. He went to the Senate Majority Leader and said, would the Democrats be willing to support this? And the Senate Majority Leader, a man by the name of Lyndon Johnson, said, no, that'd be crazy. The irony of that is, a decade later, it'd be Lyndon Johnson who would commit American forces to South Vietnam. That's called irony. That's called an ironic twist of fate. So, the French surrendered. They were surrounded, couldn't get resupplied. Elite French paratroopers surrendered. A humiliating defeat. I want to go to Vietnam and I want to go to Dien Bien Phu. I'm just saying it. Vietnam would be really cool. The problem with Vietnam would be driving around Vietnam, I guess, is crazy, and reading road signs would be very difficult for somebody who does not speak Vietnamese. But out of this is going to come the Geneva Accords. And what it did, divide up into 4 countries. But the big one is South Vietnam and North Vietnam would have an election. They'll be unified. Here's John Foster Dulles talking about it. But the United States is like, no. Because everybody knew Ho Chi Minh in the North would win an election, his party, and the Viet Minh would unify Vietnam. The U.S. was opposed, therefore, and they got the South to nix the elections. And that's what would begin the Vietnam War, right there. The U.S. saying no elections. If the U.S. would have allowed for elections, Vietnam would have been unified under probably Ho Chi Minh. Who knows what kind of government they would have had. He was certainly a socialist. But because of the U.S., the thing's going to last until 1975. And millions will die, including nearly 60,000 Americans. So, now if you look next to it, it has Kennedy's reason for the war. Well, Kennedy's reasons for the war will be the same as Ike's, 2 Vietnams. The United States is going to want 2 Vietnams. A North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, but the U.S. wants a South Vietnam. We haven't had our own dictator, Nguyen Diem. The Vietnamese language is, the French took a language of 10,000 characters and put into the Latin alphabet of 26. And so D is sometimes pronounced like duh, and sometimes like a TZ. So, okay. I guess G, J, and G here. J and G. Is G a letter? Should be. He's a dictator. Don't worry about C though. Don't worry about C. He's our ally. He's our dictator there. We're stuck with him. Even though the U.S. didn't put him in power, he's the man that we have. And Eisenhower would soon send advisors to train the South Vietnamese army. The first U.S. soldier to die in South Vietnam would be 1959. Kennedy would increase that to over 16,000 advisors and make it important. We can't lose in Vietnam. Kennedy would do that. Who are they fighting? Okay, they're a lot more communists, but the big thing is, this is the fight will be a civil war in Vietnam. That's what the U.S. is involved in, a civil war in Vietnam. The National Liberation Front were nationalists, and some were without a doubt communists, and they were directed by the North, contrary to what some anti-war people said in the United States. The NLF won Vietnam. Does everyone get that? The U.S. fight is for 2 Vietnam, and we're going to help South Vietnam against 1 Vietnam. We are going to put that in there. But Diem is going to call them the Viet Cong, for Vietnamese communists. He knew that would freak out the United States, which it did. And so that's why, if you've ever heard of the Viet Cong, that's where it comes from. Cong means communist. And here are the irregular guerrilla soldiers. It was a guerrilla war in South Vietnam. When the U.S. started sending troops into South Vietnam in 1965, North Vietnam started sending troops into South Vietnam. But it's a civil war. The Vietnam War is a civil war in South Vietnam. We'll come back to Kennedy, but that'll be the fighting in North and South Vietnam. I can still remember seeing the Vietnam War on TV. But also in 1956, if you look on that review packet, it's on there too. Where is it at? Yeah, right above Guatemala. So you have Iran. Okay, 1956, the people of Hungary removed a horrible Stalinist dictator with encouragement from the United States. The U.S. said, we will come to your aid if you remove. But you notice, Hungary has no common border with NATO or any U.S. ally. Austria is neutral. So they're kind of isolated. The Soviets, once they realized that the United States is preoccupied, they invaded and overran and put back a dictator. Here's a Soviet tank, a T-55 tank in Budapest. And the Radio Budapest, which was taken over by the guerrillas, were the last things, or the anti-Stalinists. One of the last group there, they kept coming on going on the radio and saying, we're still waiting for America. We're waiting for America. They promised to come to our aid. And the United States did not. They are still upset about this in Hungary. But I should add one thing. This shows the problem with the Cold War brinksmanship. Are we, the United States, really willing to destroy the world for Hungary? And the Hungarians don't see it that way, but the U.S., are you willing to have World War III for Hungary? Are you willing to fight and die for Hungary? And that shows the problem with brinksmanship. Are you really willing to do it if they call your bluff? And the answer was no. But as a matter of fact, you notice how I said Stalin is dictator? Stalin wasn't around anymore. In 1953, shocking everybody, Stalin died and is still dead. I will tell you stories about Stalin's death. I love the German poster. But after a year-long power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev would take over power in the Soviet Union, but he was never had the full power like Stalin did. No leader of the Soviet Union ever had power like Stalin. There was always a small group of officials. And Khrushchev's name would also contribute to a vast shortage of H's all over the world. But Khrushchev, he Don't forget all the H's. And he was a bombastic leader, but he wanted to show that they're winning the Cold War to end the Cold War. And one of his great achievements, he had nothing to do with it, but remember when he took over as premier, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite, which is on your list too, isn't it on there?
Yep.
Sputnik? Yeah, good, Sputnik, the first satellite, 1957. Now the satellite was not much bigger than a basketball, the orbit degraded very quickly, but had no radio transmission. Transmitter, they just beeped. Just beep, beep, beep. Pretty good, huh? Feel like you're there? You can pick it up on a short-range radio. In fact, you can see it go across the sky. The orbit was so low. And Eisenhower knew this was no big deal, really. The U.S. was actually far ahead in missile technology. But the people of the United States are terrified. If you could get a rocket to take a satellite up into space, couldn't you get a rocket to take an atomic bomb over the Arctic and hit the U.S. in 30 minutes? This just convinced everyone the Soviets are winning. Eisenhower freaked out. Both the Army and Navy were working on rockets. So the Eisenhower administration had to do something, so announced the Navy team will build a rocket to match Sputnik. Nobody was more surprised than the Navy team. The Army team was actually ahead. And so the Navy decided to launch their rocket. And here's a picture of it on the launch pad. It made it up 2 feet, then blew up. So now we look like even bigger idiots. Are you ready for one of my favorite headlines in the history of all newspapers? Now, eventually the U.S. would get a satellite. The U.S. was ahead, but the Soviets were taking much greater risks. And at least for the short run worked until they had a rocket explode on the launching pad in 1966. And that's how come they quit trying to go to the moon.
America's
Huh?
Oh, it said America's Sputnik dies leaving.
Okay, that's good. I like that. So everyone just thought the Soviets are winning. This is going to lead to two big things. The creation of NASA to coordinate the space race, but it's really going to be against the Soviet Union. But also, you can see this by U.S. education life. The first time in American history, aid for schools at all, but schools for science and math education, which have been avoided since the school monkey trial. So, that's Sputnik. But ironically, both Khrushchev and Eisenhower wanted some kind of peace agreement. They both wanted to end the war. Khrushchev was desperate to stop the drain of the arms race on the Soviet economy. So a plan was in Paris. But while this is going on, the United States had been spying on the Soviets for 3 years with a spy plane called Utility Plane 2, which was all purely meant as a meaningless gibberish, the U, but the U-2. Using its spying on it. This plane could get at 65,000 feet. And so if you look at your sheet, it should have U-2, right? Does it have U-2? Yeah. The U-2 incident. So these were illegal spy planes. Khrushchev was furious and said, no more or no Paris peace agreement. And Eisenhower ordered the CIA, no more. By the way, the U-2 is nothing more than like a big glider. It can fly about 65,000 feet, but it can't maneuver. But it can fly over Soviet air defenses. But every year, Soviet missiles are getting longer range, are getting closer. Well, the CIA told Eisenhower, we need one more flight. Just one more flight before the Paris summit. Does anybody want to guess what happened to that one more flight? It was shot down. Francis Gary Powers was the pilot. His plane was shot down when the engine went out and started gliding down to a lower altitude. The Soviets shot it down. The U.S. claimed that it was a weather plane that got lost. We're sorry for the loss of the brave pilot. Well, Powers, as it turned out, didn't want to die and got out of the plane that didn't have an ejector seat. The assumption was they're dead and shot down. Here he is with a horribly dislocated shoulder. The Soviets showed him and the wreckage, and this destroyed the chance for peace. Destroyed. If you go to the Moscow, their army museum, it's still there, the wreckage from the U-2. He'd be released, exchanged for 38 spies. We desperately wanted to get him back. But this ended the chance for peace, and probably the most dangerous time of the Cold War will go on for the next 4 years. It's no coincidence that you have the increased U.S. involvement in South Vietnam during this time of intense Cold War fear, the building of the Berlin Wall, etc. Now we're going to jump ahead to, we'll come back to this, the election of 1960. So the election of 1960, a very young, upstart Democrat. Yeah. 1960. I have no idea why I've been out of order a little bit, but I do. John Kennedy would be the Democrat running for president, to be the youngest man ever elected, a liberal Democrat from Massachusetts who wanted to continue the New Deal. His running mate would be the Senate Majority Leader, the second most powerful man in Washington, D.C. at that time, Lyndon Johnson. This is also a bad omen whenever I mention the vice president, isn't it? He would run against Richard Nixon, who was ICE vice president. Everyone saw him as an up-and-coming president. Kennedy had a reputation of being a complete lightweight playboy. He did almost nothing in the Senate. But by the way, can't that be a positive? He has no history, so they can create an image. So they created this image of this young, fit, vigorous man, even though he was not at all. He nearly died in 1957 and was on a whole entire cocktail of amphetamines and steroids just to get him through the day. But they kept that secret from the American public. He was given the last rites 3 times, John Kennedy. The last time would be then, but yeah. Easy. But remember the bomber gap in 52? Well, this time the Kennedy campaign used the missile gap because of Sputnik, the Soviets must have all these missiles, right? And we were vulnerable. And yes, you can buy a plastic bottle kit of the missiles. Wouldn't that be awesome? Okay, fine.
Do you want that?
Yeah. This is the Satan missile. Okay, so was there a missile gap? A huge missile gap. Just the other way around. The United States had over 500 medium and short-range missiles that reached the Soviet Union, and over 100 ICBMs. And they're just about to put in the Minuteman I missiles near Malmstrom Air Force Base. The Soviets had how many missiles that could reach the U.S.? 2. But it took a whole day to fuel. They're way behind. But people believed it because of Sputnik. And one more thing. This would also be the first ever televised debate. And even though the debate was relatively even by people listening to it, Kennedy came off looking better. He looked young, fit, while Nixon looked like a sinister chipmunk. All right, I'll tell you the truth about the debate. I'll cover a lot more tomorrow. I covered a lot here, getting bounced around a little bit, I'm sorry. So if anybody has any questions on Friday, on Friday. Yeah, but if you have any questions, if you want to come in at lunch, especially tomorrow and Wednesday, I'll be glad to answer questions. And don't forget, on Wednesday, I will look at your review packet. You have to bring it. I'm just going to look at it, make sure you got most of it done, and you're okay. Yeah. Huh? What test? This is okay. Remind me tomorrow if we get a conference or something like that. I know all the AP tests all roll together. Maybe not go. I guess I won't see you Thursday either. I'll see you next week. Oh, good. How's it? That's awesome. And I hope we went back a few of her like, oh.
When do you plan to look at me?
Huh?
Today, right?
No, not Wednesday. Yeah. But I'm going to go through everything. I'm going to go through a bunch of stuff today from your review packet.
Okay, how much do you want us to have done by Wednesday?
Huh?
How much do you want us to have done by Wednesday?
Just have a really good hunk of it done. I mean, this is for your test on Thursday, so I want as much of it done as possible on Thursday. So you're going to be doing a practice test in class on Wednesday.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna go around and just check to make sure.
How much,
And then I'll collect it again on Monday.
how much do
On
you,
Wednesday, right?
Huh?
You got school this Wednesday?
Yeah.
how much do you want done of the review on Wednesday?
A good hunk of it.
I didn't
Like,
Yeah, somewhere around,
So for you, like,
it'd be very arbitrary, I'll look at what we got most of the time.
yeah, it's like, we got the last pages.
Bet you can. Yeah, and I'll go over even more on the review session. I did, enough people asked for it, I will do a review session on Tuesday. By the way, if you haven't got a review session, boy, have you missed a lot of material. But you're still accountable for it, I don't care. I already know it. If you have your review packet, go and bring it out, I'll directly fill some in, and I'll fill in a bunch more tomorrow. So you might have to get some of the 60s on your own, I'm sorry. I'll go through absolutely as much as I can.